My name is Ben Lafort, and I am a Senior Policy Analyst at the OFA, and I'm going to be monitoring this session on the Ontario Farmland Value and Ontario Farmland Value and Rental Value Survey. I am pleased to introduce Dr. Brady Deaton. Dr. Deaton is a professor and McCain Family Chair in Food Security in the Department of Food, Agricultural, and Resource Economics at the University of Guelph. He's also president of the Canadian Agricultural Economic Society. So good afternoon, Dr. Deaton. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Can you hear me, Ben?
I can hear you, Brady. Yep.
And can you see me?
Yes, we can see your screen sharing, and now we can see your video as well.
All right. How's that? How are we? All right.
Good.
Let me begin and make sure I say the two most important things that I want to say to start off with. First of all, thank you. Thank you to many of the OFA membership who have filled out this survey, as I'm going to try to impress upon you in the remainder of this presentation. It's important. And the second most important thing that I want to say, if you haven't gone to the website that provides the results, then that URL is right there on farmlandsurveys.com. And I'm going to impress upon you as well, I hope, through the remainder of this presentation, the importance of the information that's provided there. Now, I want to start off and make it very clear what the pitch is going to be that I'm going to deliver in this presentation. And I'm going to back off a little bit and give you the wind up. The pitch is that the value added of this project is that it provides you, that would be government agents, farmers, and the general public, with unique and accessible data on very important aspects of the agriculture sector in Ontario. The second value added is it provides unique farmland rental and price information. And that in addition, and important in these times, is that it provides information about future expectations of people in the agriculture sector. And I'm going to bring those three themes together in a minute. But before I do that fully, I want to give you the wind up of why my students and my colleagues that are involved in this project are so excited about it. And I'm going to give you my second favorite figure that I have. And what you can see here is the history of per capita income in a book called The Farewell to Arms. And I think it's important at all times when we talk about the projects regarding plastic and trying to understand the effect of the carbon tax and trying to reallocate and enhance the labor, all of the presentations that we've been listening to in the 3 hours, that those things incrementally are critical in sustaining the growth, which is a unique character of our times. So what you have here is income per person. It's sort of set at 1 in 1800, and you can look through most of time. You know, we're talking back to the Peloponnesian Wars or something like that, to somewhere, and scholars debate this, but somewhere where the Industrial Revolution occurs. For most of that time up to that point, somebody could say, I'm as well off as my grandparents, and they were as well off as their grandparents, and they were as well off as their grandparents. But starting after the Industrial Revolution, we started to have positive growth. And preceding the Industrial Revolution was the critical innovation in the agriculture sector, which turned on the reallocation of land and the clarification of property in ways that enabled productive resources in the agriculture to be released in a way that released employment to the urban areas and kind of set us on our way in terms of positive growth. Just perhaps as an aside, this figure also puts in perspective the miracle of the last 20 years with respect to China and looking at sort of close to average 10% growth rates per annum. Well, what that means, and Larry Summers makes this point, is that, you know, at around a 7% growth rate, a figure doubles every decade. So what we've seen in China, and of course what we're seeing in terms of increased demand for agriculture commodities, is something that on this graph we didn't see change for thousands of years, all of a sudden doubling every 10 years. That's the difference between a bike and then 10 years later, the person owning a scooter, 10 years later, a car, etc. And of course, that's an upward pressure on commodity prices that we're experiencing now. And even before that great miracle in China, China itself had an agricultural revolution in the 80s that too increased productivity and allowed it to basically get on this amazing miracle growth that we've seen. I want to put that in perspective a little bit. When we think about just what we've seen in Canada, we've seen this same kind of dynamic. Here I've kind of, all right, so this is going to tell you how many minutes it takes for the average Canadian to earn a dozen eggs in 1935 and in 2008. So on the left-hand axis going up, you have the number of minutes in 1935 that it took the average laborer to earn a dozen eggs. So the average laborer worked just south of 110 minutes to earn a dozen eggs that cost 31 cents in 1935. And in 2008, the average earner could do that, you know, in less than 10 minutes. And what's critical to enabling that has not only been the kind of techniques and the allocation of labor and manufacturing that has been discussed in other parts of the presentation, the presentations earlier today. What's also been important to that is our capacity to make land fungible, to move it among producers, to increase the scale by which farmers are working, and to enable successive access to farmland by farmers. That information and that capacity is not only a function of individual entrepreneurial efforts and the system of the market, it's also been very much a function of policy. And so information about aspects of that sector, understanding the intricate relationship between landlords who are producers and also landlords who are renting out their land is critical. And that's the issue that I've discovered during my research. So this is still part of the wind up, but what I'm going to do now is move into a series of research papers and areas that emphasize the important need to understand both farmers as producers, but also farmers as landlords, and to understand the rental market. I think we're all familiar with some of the stylized facts, but the value of farmland is the critical asset in terms of the wealth of farmers. About 40% of Canadian farmland is in the rental market. In Ontario, it's less than that, around 30, 32. And we know that of that land in the rental market, much of it, about half, is not owned by people who are active farmers. And so understanding and getting information about things like rental rates and land values is going to be critical. Let me show you how this understanding has played its way out for me as a professor starting around 2004. In 2004, there was much discussion and then a moratorium on farmland in this green area. Farmland that was designated as the protected countryside and now is known broadly as being green belted. And at the time, governments were arguing that this was necessary to support farming, and many agreed. But one of the issues that I raised at the time was that many of the farmers are also landlords who may view a zoning control that keeps land in farming as something that potentially threatens their asset base. And we've done at least 2 studies on that. But the point that I just want to make for the point of this presentation is that understanding, particularly in the urban area, which we're going to talk about when we talk about some of the data from the survey, understanding this relationship between landlord and farmer is critical. And by the way, with respect to all the studies that I'm about to mention, Ben will make them available journal articles that go into the nuances of the results and the nuances of these arguments. So there will be 3 to 4 journal articles that will be available with this presentation that you can look at for more detail. So understanding that the farmer is both a landlord and a landowner as well as a farmer is important to understanding the effects of zoning policies in Ontario. Understanding that farmers, particularly as our survey shows, as farmers are actively working more and more acres, they are more likely to be renting more and more land. And so farmers, of course, are concerned about rental rates. So at around 2000, this is results from 2013 research, we were looking at, for example, who are these different landlords? So we did a survey of farmers and we asked those farmers about the landlords that they were renting from. And here you can see some would describe them as an active farmer, some would describe them as a widower or retired farmer. A non-farmer investor is also a large category. And we were interested in particular whether, after controlling for things like land quality and location, whether we would see these different groups charging higher or lower rental rates by their category. And even though, of course, as you can see here, an active farmer was shown as charging more than a non-farmer investor, when we did things like control for average land quality, we found that there weren't differences between the categories, or for the most part, there were some minor ones. There weren't statistically significant differences in the rental rates that were being charged. I would say we also asked landlords at this time how they viewed the information that these different categories had about rental rates in their area. So they viewed, for example, active farmers as being much more up to speed on what the rental rates were than in particularly the government, who they viewed as not having a very good idea of it. So that's one good additional reason for supporting this research, is to provide a broader understanding amongst all of these groups. More recently, we examined issues concerning the adoption of conservation practices and how it varies between owned land and rented land. So what you have here is the percentage of the adoption of conservation tillage by farmers on their own land versus land that's rented, and the same thing with cover crops. And what you can see is, with respect to conservation tillage, there's really no different. Farmers tend to treat their own land like the land that they rent in, but with cover crops, we found somewhat more of a difference between owned and rented. One of the interesting things about this research is that we find that if the farmer has an expectation of being able to rent the land for more than 5 years, then farmers tend to be just as likely to do things like plant cover crops on the land. So the time expectation associated with being able to rent the land is important. All of these issues that I've just mentioned, the green belt, understanding the rental market, understanding conservation practices, which I think was getting to some of the things that Alan was talking about when we kind of think about fixating carbon and going future, are really important and require good information about the character of the agriculture sector in Ontario, which, as we'll talk about in a second, our survey provides. The other thing, of course, understanding farming, understanding farmland ownership and understanding the asset value of farming has been an ongoing consideration, and we try to capture some of that in our survey with respect to future expectations of farmers with respect to farmland prices. And I'll just say, I think the backbone of all the conversations that I have is the the memory of 1980, the rapid movement of prices from 1970 to 1980 to its peak, and then to its decline over till around 1986, and then the long, steady 20-something years that it took to kind of get back to that 1980 values. And then, of course, we're all aware of the increases that in land values that we've seen in recent times. This kind of idea of prices rising and falling from the 1980s provides a bit of a specter and a discussion piece that we continue to talk about land values. And some aspects of this are captured in our survey. So that's the wind up. Here's the delivery. Here's what the promise of the survey is. And the promise of the survey is to provide, in a publicly accessible manner, key results about the agriculture sector and land ownership issues that are useful for policymakers, some of the policy issues that are associated with some of the issues that I mentioned earlier. So between January and February, surveys go out through the OFA, supported financially by OMAFRA, and facilitated by my colleague. I just have to do a shout out to my colleague Bethany Lipka, who's very involved in supporting the online survey as well as providing this online portal. That survey goes out. And by the last survey, I think it's done in mid-February, we basically stop for what we're doing and work full scale so that these reports, after you've done the survey in January, February, are made available to you in March, early April. And that is one of the kind of value-added promises of the survey that we have really strived to do. And it's our hope that by turning around these surveys fast and accurate, that that'll be appreciated by the people that fill them out. So the first thing you do when you go to the survey is you'll see that each year you can get a report for the years that we've done them. And in addition, there is an aggregation of all the reports and a PDF, so you can download that. The second thing you see when you get to the site is that you can play around with the interactive maps. So if you want to look at what we call a heat map, so if you want to see that, for example, 3 of the key elements are rent, price, and the rent-price ratio. And I'll talk about them in a minute, but you can kind of quickly assess how it changes spatially. So the colored items are the items that we have data for. And if we don't have more than 10 responses in the survey, we don't fill in that county. So the second thing that you can see here, in addition to providing this information to you online, we've set up a public data repository because one day we won't be here and that online survey and that website might be gone. But this data will be, because we've done it. We've created a public data repository through the University of Guelph with the DOI that will carry all the information that we provide. And we view this transparency both in the short term and in the very long run as critical, because as I was explaining in the windup, we view this issue of land and land ownership is critical to developing our understanding of what's going on in that agriculture sector. So if you open those PDFs, let me just do one more shout out here. There's a lot of other links to information. There's short papers on what the net return would be under different rent scenarios. There are links to podcasts on a variety of different things related to the agriculture sector. But the key focus is on this data. One of the things, and I'm not going to have time to go through all of the charts, so I urge you to see it, but let me just kind of look at what we're talking about when we get this response from the OFA membership. So the first question, of course, is to ask them to categorize themselves into a number of categories. And so this is not mutually exclusive. So, for example, most of the respondents filling out the survey are identifying themselves as a farmland owner, and about 70% of those farmland owners are also identifying themselves as an active farmer. Some are identifying them tenants, some as a landlord exclusively. And so this is the kind of setting or the kind of data characterization of the respondents that we're getting in our survey. Now I'm going to turn back to this heat map. And we're aware of the large rental market, but there hasn't been for some time a lot of really good data on what rental rates are. And so looking at the relationship between rental rates and the price of farmland, and then taking kind of a crude return on investment by taking the rent price ratio, we can identify, I think, one of the additional fundamentals in the Ontario ag sector, which is the real and powerful effect of Toronto, or basically the Golden Horseshoe area where the majority of people in the province live. And let me kind of just show you that heat map and then kind of focus in on a couple of specific items. So when you go to the website, you can download and get specific information for these counties. But you can also see that in a more specific way. And I want to make the point about the effect of the urban area. So I just want to point out, so on your left-hand axis, this would be referring to the rental rate, which will be measured in blue. And on the right hand, that's capturing the farmland values. And I want to compare selectively two of the counties in the data set. So Wellington, this is from 2019, and Peel. So in Wellington, the rent that we gathered from a survey was around 150, and the value per acre of farmland was around 15,000. But you can see that in Peel, the rent is lower, but the value of farmland is much higher. The rent price ratio shows, with respect to Peel, of course, that the return on investment associated with agriculture is quite low, and that's something else that's driving those land prices are largely non-agriculture development interests. And you can just sort of see here now, going back to the kind of effect of a heat map, the arrow is pointing to Toronto, and you can see the darkened area of Peel, and that's capturing that farmland value, that high farmland value. Another interesting thing, one of the most interesting things to come out of the survey is that we're able to then kind of compare a place like Peel and Bruce by the percentage of farmland sales that the OFA membership believes are being made by farmers. So in Bruce, the OFA membership is reporting that they think about 85% of these farmland sales are going to are being made by farmers, but in Peel, in the regional municipality of Peel, very little. So around 5% are being made by farmers, and that's consistent with this kind of observation that the Toronto, effect is one of the fundamentals influencing farmland values in Ontario. Let me say that there's much more that you can say about the data, and if you go to the website, you'll see things like the median number of landlords, which is around 3, that farmers who are renting inland have. You'll see information about the number of stipulations associated on land that's rented in, which are quite low. One of the real implications of having done this for the 5 years I'm most proud of, though, is I believe the effects that it's had in terms of its enduring effects. And let me mention a couple. We've been doing this since 2015 and sharing our results and our survey approach with FCC. And I was very proud, and I have to think that our project very much inspired that FCC is now providing farmland rental analysis, albeit not as granular as we're providing it. But for the first time ever, for 2020, FCC provided farmland rental rates analysis. And I think this speaks to the project that's been supported by OMAFRA and you, and that FCC is now following suit. In journal articles examining COVID-19 in Canadian farmland markets, Chad Lawley was referencing our survey to help understand issues during the COVID era. And here, he is drawing on some of the expectations of farmland that we provided in our survey. For example, in the last survey, we asked people if they thought farmland rental markets were affected by COVID-19, and generally the answer is no. We also asked farmland, we also asked the OFA membership if they were, how they anticipated farm prices to proceed over the coming year. And they were more positive, as you'll see if you compare the 2020 to the 2019 survey, than they had been in the past about the future of farmland prices. And so far that seems borne out. Now, one of the other things that we do is immediately after the survey, we get lots of calls and lots of emails. I'm just going to talk about a couple of, because I view this as an important aspect of the outreach program of this grant. So the biggest category is kind of like miscellaneous. One of my favorite calls was from a farmer who wanted me to provide the links to someone contemplating renting out land in their area to serve as a starting point for discussions about the rental market. And we're very clear in our survey that there's a spread and that each particular parcel will have to be unique in terms of what the rental rate and the value is, has to be determined. But we hope that the central tendency is useful in the way that this farmer contacted me about. Let's say one of our also large categories, which I hope is inspiration for you to encourage others to continue to fill out the survey. We have one more year left in the grant, is requests for more results. So many farmers who have, for particular areas that don't get enough observations for us to provide it, would like would like access to those results, wish that it was published with it. But when you only have one or two responses in a particular area, it's not a very useful piece of information. And I would say, one of the interesting things is that there is a lot of landlords requesting advice on rental rates, which I can just assure you is I never provide because I'm not in a position to do that. But I think it's interesting how many people out there call me with questions that reveal to me how little they know about the value, at least in the rental market, of the asset they own. I know that Bill Gates is the largest farmland owner in North America, and I assume he doesn't have that problem, but it'd be interesting to ask him. So in summary, this project is about providing clear, transparent, and timely information to everybody about farmland ownership, farmland price, and future expectations and rental rates that I believe are critical to good policy and good decisions in the agriculture sector. And that's what this project does. All of us, really, everyone on this call, is very much involved in that project, and I thank you for it. And at this point, I'll be happy to take any questions.
Great, thanks Brady, for the fantastic presentation. So yeah, we're going to begin the Q&A session now. So if you have questions for Professor Deaton, put them into the questions box now. So we'll wait a few moments to see if there are any questions coming in. I'll get it started because I know there's a couple of questions. There's one question I get all the time and I would never have an answer for, and then I'll pose it to you. First one, to kind of get the ball rolling. Brady, do you have an idea of the percentage of farms that might be foreign owned? Is a very common question that we get all the time.
Yeah, very low. So we've taken a look at this in a couple of different ways, but basically our estimates of this through survey and then in a more kind of specific way, which I won't go into details because it'll be hard to remember that, but between, probably south of 2%. Just a little bit. So like 1.7 or something like that was the estimate. I think there's a couple of things with respect to this to keep in mind. The first is that there is a lot of non-farmer ownership of farmland. And the majority of that non-farmer ownership of farmland is likely, the overwhelming majority is Canadian. A second point that I like to point out is to keep in mind when we think about this issue is the largest foreign owner of farmland, even though it's a small category, is very likely to be the United States. And we know in the United States, because we have very good data on this, that Canada and Canadians are the largest foreign owner of US farm and forest land. So those are a couple of things that I would just throw out there to keep in perspective. I get that question quite a bit as well.
Yeah. Okay, so this one maybe may not get as much because it's more based on recent trends. So at one point during the presentation, you showed the slides of the rental rates, the cash rent versus the price of land in Wellington and Peel to show the kind of Toronto effect, as you mentioned. So as we've seen residential real estate in a number of areas like Guelph, London, Kitchener-Waterloo skyrocket in the past 12 months or so, would you expect to see that type, or I guess would you see a Toronto effect kind of moving to other urban areas that have seen that kind of increase in residential values? So would you expect Wellington to move a little closer to what Peel is in terms of the rental to price ratios, given what we've seen in a lot of urban real estate markets in the last 12 months or so?
Let me answer that answer in a couple of ways, and some that might be helpful to whoever answered the question. First of all, there's a really interesting article that's available right now. There's two actually, from the Canadian Journal of Agriculture Economics. And the one that I referenced in the slide by Chad Lawley would be available to you. I think it's open access currently. And in there, he talks about, he actually does a study during the COVID, he's trying to get at the COVID effect. And he actually examines prices, I believe, around Winnipeg to assess whether or not, like the COVID effect, that is the movement, potentially the interest of people moving out of, say, urban areas into more rural areas during the COVID effect, had an upward effect on farmland prices. Now, it's a 2020 studies, and he's not sort of arguing it's causal, but he does find an association there that I think is worth pondering. In that paper, and I forget exactly how, he does mention the real estate prices in Guelph as being very, very important. My sense of it is, at least over the COVID period, and it's hard to disentangle what we've seen in terms of interest rates from everything, but that there has been, buyers looking to move away from that Toronto area, and so that could expand the contagion more directly to Wellington. Whether or not you'd see Wellington sort of have the Peel price, I mean, I doubt it at this point, but would there be upward pressure from that? Sure.
Yeah. And so, okay, I'm not seeing any other questions, but maybe perhaps one other question to follow up on the foreign ownership piece. You mentioned, because this is another question we get quite a bit often as well. I know I have a lot of members have asked this. So you mentioned the foreign ownership is quite low, but that a lot of land is owned by non-farmers. Do we have a sense from the data, any data source, of what percentage of a Canadian farmland and Ontario farmland might be owned by, say, like investors and institutional investors, or what role just pure investors are playing in the market for farmland?
Well, let me see if I can go back to a slide. Is my screen up?
Just your video camera at the moment.
Let me see if I can get this. I think I might have a little bit of information on that in one of this. Oh, sorry.
There it is. Yep.
Is it up? Okay. Or at least this slide might help me speak to it. Okay, so like one thing, yeah, I would say that we found out. We're going back now a little bit. I was trying to describe to you the journey to behind a lot of the research that motivated doing the survey. But so it's probably more than this year, but around 2013, we were seeing, somewhat that farmers were identifying sort of an investment company as the buyer of the land or the landlord that they were renting from is relatively small. Now, I would expect that to have increased over the last 7 years. But non-farmer investors are a large portion of that. Now, what does that mean? That can mean someone like, say, my family owns farmland in Missouri. And I would imagine the person who rents from us might view us as a non-farmer investor in the farmland because we're not actively farming. I'd say that's a large portion of it.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Okay, and we have one more question in here. Actually, we have two more questions. First one is asking, do people rent out land? Do they only care about how much maximizing dollars per acre, or do they consider renting to farmers on a longer term, perhaps at a discount that practice soil conservation, planting trees, etc., on their own farms? And what factors determines who landowners rent to?
Okay, there's a lot there, so I'll try to answer some of it, and if you're not satisfied, then just kind of pepper me back, a follow-up question. All right, so we do know a little bit of that. I'm not going to be able to pull up the numbers exactly. Let me tell you what we do know, which will be in one of the papers, the paper from Deaton, Nadella, and Lawley that will be available to you. We'll go into this in more detail. But one aspect of the question is, are the landlords, do they just care about the price of farmland? And I guess we don't find different landlord categories mattering that much in terms of the rental rate provided. In other words, when we control for things like land quality, the rental market seems to be fairly competitive. So when people are identifying what the price is, things like the quality of the land, the topography of the land, these things are entering in more importantly to determining the land price than who the particular owner is. And that'll be detailed with empirics in one of the papers that you will have available to you. So that's one aspect of the answer. With respect, I think there's a lot. So the other question is like, what do we know about the adoption of conservation practices? And I'll just we're on the slide here, cover crops, for example. And so I'll just talk to you a little bit about the research that I've done using some of the data like that we're talking about, but I don't think the answer is so conclusive. But here I'll tell you some general insights. So with respect to how the farmer is going to treat rented land versus the way they own, with something that's like conservation tillage, something whose innovation essentially moves with the machinery, we find that there's really no difference. And then we move to something like cover crops, whose benefit runs with the land. You would expect there to be some difference. However, when farmers have a longer term expectation about how long they will rent the land from, they tend to be more likely to treat the land in a similar way to the way they would their own land. Now, one of the things that comes out of the study, and you'll see when you read, if you're able to read the article, is that we did find a little bit of difference, but we're not so sure exactly what's going on. But what we think we see going on is that farmers tend to respond differently if the landlord is a farmer than they do if they are a non-farmer. And that in addition to the importance of the temporal expectation of how long they're going to rent the land, it does appear that farmers are more likely to treat the land they own like the land they rent in if the landlord is a farmer. Now that result is something that we really need to explore more, but it's a very exciting one, and I hope in the future to be able to report to you something more definitive on that relationship.
Oh, that's great.
There might be more to that question. That's what I can. Those are the two parts of it that I think I can answer.
No, yeah, I think you nailed it. It was, yeah, they were asking about, yeah, the conservation type of practices for non-farmer owned land, and as well as what factors someone might look for when they're renting land. Another question in here, and this is one I spent every day for the last 8 years working on. Will land taxes go up with land values?
It depends on, so you're paying 25% residential, so it'll depend on how the ratio of the agriculture land values moves with respect to the ratio of the real estate. Generally speaking, if you keep I mean, there's a lot of things that go on here. So the municipality is going to set the tax rate to cover its expenses. So in a sense, if their expenses stayed the same and farmland values went up, they could lower their tax rate. But generally that doesn't happen. So my general expectation would be yes, but there's a lot of qualifiers and moving targets, as you know, Ben. You're probably in a better position to answer that quickly than I am. But you're welcome to add in to that answer. But there are a lot of moving variables.
Sure. So maybe I'll add in, because I have spent a lot of time on this. Yeah, generally, yeah, as Brady said, all things being equal, and a disproportional increase in farm. The big thing here is how is farmland moving relative to the other property classes in town. And what we've seen for a while is that it's been moving much faster than residential, commercial, industrial, and rural areas. That may change soon in some areas, but what we've seen succeeded a lot faster, and as a result, tax burdens have increased. And we worked with our county federations with municipalities at county levels to address that issue with varying levels of success. So any member who is interested in that question or worried about that question can certainly give me a call directly or email me. Happy to discuss it in more detail.
Yeah, one of the interesting things, Ben, just to kind of riff on what you just said there, that we've talked about with respect to the survey and that it provides insight potentially for policymakers, is that when you get into those near urban areas and you see these valuation and the potential and the kind of buyers of land and so forth, that urban pressure, and you see the rental values, which are typically, by the way, which comes out in the survey, much stickier than land values, and the rental values not reflecting the magnitude of price differences that are associated with the Toronto effect. Those rental rates tell you a little bit more about the agriculture return associated with those properties as distinct from the urban effect.
Absolutely. Okay, that's great. And we are wrapping up just at 4 o'clock. I don't see any other questions coming in. So that is perfect timing. Professor Deaton, thank you again so much for your fantastic presentation. This is a really valued survey to our members and OFA as an organization as well. So thank you again. We look forward to future iterations of the survey. And again, to anyone who is interested, the journal articles that Professor Deaton mentioned will be made available to anyone who would like to read them. So thank you so much.